Hi, my name is Dr. Jay Weil. I want to tell you why I'm a creationist when so many other scientists are not. I'm making this tape in response to a question I get at virtually every creation science conference I speak at, as well as many homeschooling conferences I go to and other venues in which I speak. When I present the case for creation, I present it very strongly. And in the end, so many people ask me, if the case for creation is so incredibly strong, why aren't more scientists creationists? Well, there's not an easy answer to that question. I don't mean to imply there isn't an answer to that question. There certainly is one, but it's not an easy one. It takes a long time. It won't fit into a 5 or 10 minute reply. So I'm making a tape in reply to this question. You see, in order to understand why most scientists are not creationists, you have to be given a context in which to understand how someone becomes a scientist. Becoming a scientist is a very different process. In my opinion, it's much different than becoming a sheet metal worker or becoming some other skilled trade person. Becoming a scientist involves quite a bit of indoctrination. It's mostly unintentional, but it's still there. And to really understand why most scientists aren't creationists, you really need to be given a context in which to understand how someone becomes a scientist. So the context I'm going to give you is my life. I'm going to tell you how I became a scientist and the steps that led up to that. And hopefully you will see why in the end it is so hard for scientists to be creationists. Now, a lot of people might say this is just an excuse to get me to talk about my life. Well, maybe it is. I don't know. But I honestly believe the only answer to the question, why aren't more scientists creationists, lies in examining how we become scientists. So, in my life, I was tracked to be a scientist at a very early age. You see, at an early age, elementary school, I showed a talent for both science and mathematics. And as a result of this talent, my public school teachers tracked me into being a scientist. They gave me special projects, accelerated classes, those sorts of things to try and develop my talent in science and mathematics. Now, the public schools don't do this much anymore, and it's too bad, because I benefited a lot from this tracking. I really learned a lot of science and math, a lot more than I normally would have learned, and my appreciation for science was much larger as a result. There was one negative to this, however. This tracking left me with the strong impression that it is impossible to be both a scientist and religious. I really believed, as a result of my education in science, that all scientists are atheists. Now, if I look back and try and figure out why I got this message, I think it's the result of indoctrination. The indoctrination is unintentional, but it's still there nevertheless. You see, in the public school system today, we have this idea of separation of church and state. It's a silly idea, an idea that doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution, and an idea that 100 years ago wasn't even considered in the United States of America, but today people consider the separation of church and state to be a very important issue. And as a result, public schools must be sanitized of religion. So when people write school books to be used in public schools, or books that are going to go on the shelves of public school libraries, they have to write these books pretty much sanitized of all religion. Now, in science, that's actually quite hard to do. The vast majority of all the great scientists of the past were all very devout Christians. There are philosophers like Stanley Yaki, for example, who believe that it's impossible to have science without Christianity. Without the worldview of Christianity, no one would expect science to work. So indeed, it is very hard to sanitize science of religion, specifically of Christianity. So as a result, because it has to be for the public schools, those who attend public school get a very warped view of science. And that's what I got. When I started showing my aptitude for science, I was given all these special projects, and I was given a lot of extra reading to do, and I had to write reports on great scientists and do little experiments at home that tried to demonstrate the kind of experiments these great scientists did. But unfortunately, because these books were written for public school students, they couldn't mention religion. So when these books talked about Sir Isaac Newton, who is considered the founder of most of modern science, They couldn't mention the fact that he still considers his greatest work, he considered his greatest work to be the commentaries that he wrote on the book of Daniel. Well, that couldn't be mentioned. Of course, these books told about how he developed physics, how he developed calculus, how he developed all these great scientific laws. But they never mentioned that he considered his greatest work to be his commentaries on the book of Daniel. They couldn't mention how devout a Christian he was, because that kind of stuff can't appear in public school textbooks. Same with James Clerk Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell started the modern physics revolution by demonstrating that electricity and magnetism were in fact the same thing. Now, James Clerk Maxwell started every experiment he did with a prayer. He started classes that he taught with prayer because he believed he was doing the Lord's work in trying to understand creation. None of that stuff could be mentioned in the public school books that I was reading. However, for the few scientists who were atheists, their views could be discussed. So growing up and being taught science by doing all these special projects and all these neat little experiments, I got the impression that scientists either didn't care about religion or were strong atheists. And as a result, I was trained and educated that all scientists are atheists. It was indoctrination, but it was unintentional. There weren't some evil people saying we have to fool everyone and think that scientists are atheists. No. As a result of the silly notion of separation of church and state, the indoctrination was a consequence of that. So anyway, by the time I reached high school, I honestly believed it was impossible to be a scientist and at the same time have any religious beliefs at all. So by the time I ended high school, I was a very proud scientist and a very proud atheist. In high school, I led atheist discussion groups after school. I argued with my Christian friends, telling them how stupid Christianity is and how would anyone believe such an absurd thing. I was a very proud atheist. Interestingly enough, despite the fact that I was a proud atheist, when I reached the 9th grade, I actually lost complete faith in the theory of evolution. And the reason was simple. In 9th grade biology class, everybody was asked to write a research report on how a scientific hypothesis was confirmed by experiment. We were supposed to go out and find some great experiment that demonstrated the confirmation of a scientific hypothesis. See, we had just learned the scientific method, and so we were supposed to show how the scientific method worked. Well, in 7th and 8th grade, I had been exposed to the theory of evolution, and, I was kind of a nerd. So when I saw something in class that I thought was interesting, I would continue to stay after school and go to the library and so forth and learn more than what the class required. So when I heard about the theory of evolution and started learning about it, I actually did a lot of reading on it because after all, I honestly believed that a scientist had to be an atheist. Well, here was this theory of evolution that supposedly showed us how life could exist without any God. So I was pretty excited and pretty impressed with this theory, and in 7th and 8th grade reading this theory, it all made a lot of sense to me. In 9th grade, however, I had to write this report on how a hypothesis was confirmed by experiment. So what I figured I'd do is take one of the hypotheses of evolution and show how it had been confirmed by experiment. So I took one of the principal tenets of evolution, that there are such a thing as beneficial mutations. Remember what the theory of evolution says. Life forms reproduce, and after lots of reproduction, every once in a while, a mutation would develop. Most mutations are bad. However, some mutations are beneficial. These beneficial mutations can stack up, causing the formation of a new species. Now, I learned that whole theory in 7th and 8th grade, and it sounded really good. And in these books that I was reading on evolution, they talked about how scientists had observed fruit flies and observed how mutations progress in fruit fly populations. And because you can have several generations of fruit flies in a very short time, the books told me that scientists were able to track mutations throughout the generations of fruit flies. So I just assumed, of course, that those experiments having to do with fruit flies, had confirmed the hypothesis that beneficial mutations exist. Well, I went to the library and did research and so forth, and I found lots of books and lots of sources about these fruit fly experiments, but I was shocked to find out that not a one of them had come up with any beneficial mutations. In fact, every mutation that they had observed was either harmful or benign. Nothing beneficial. And that shocked me at the time because remember, I was a student. I was in my formative years, and I honestly believe people did science to do science. And the scientific method states very clearly you make a hypothesis and it doesn't become a theory until you've had some experimental confirmation. Well, here's the principal tenet of evolution, and no experimental confirmation. In fact, you might even say there's negative experimental confirmation. After all, these fruit fly studies reproduce literally hundreds of thousands of generations of fruit fly. And in hundreds of thousands of generations of fruit fly, not a single beneficial mutation was found. To me, that's evidence against the hypothesis. Certainly not evidence for the hypothesis. Well, so I was running late. I had to get this paper done. I thought, well, I'll just change. I'll find another hypothesis in evolution. Let's, for example, talk about the hypothesis of one species turning into another slowly over the time. I remember seeing drawings in these books that I read on evolution showing me how one species slowly evolved over time into new species. So what I thought I'd do is just write a report on how fossils had been found showing how one species evolved into another species. So once again, went to the library, and to my dismay, I found out that these pictures that are drawn in the books are fantasy. That in fact there aren't bones to back up any of these supposed fossil transitions. In fact, in the fossil record, there's not a single example of a transition from one species to another. Now, once again, I was a formative student in those years. I honestly was shocked that people would call this the theory of evolution when its hypotheses had not been confirmed by experiment. And I was really quite amazed at this, and in the end I just said, well, evolution sounds nice, but it's not even a theory. It's not even a confirmed hypothesis. It's at best an unconfirmed hypothesis. And although it may be interesting, there's certainly very little scientific merit in it. So in the end, I stopped believing in evolution just in 9th grade. Not because I believed in creation. I was still a committed atheist. After all, in my mind, you had to be an atheist if you were a scientist. So I wasn't committed to creation, but I was also not committed to evolution. I was sort of committed to nothing at that point. I was committed to know God, but that was about as far as it went. Now that left my mind sort of open. It wasn't completely open because I still didn't believe that a scientist could be anything but an atheist, so I still couldn't believe in God. But at least my mind was open to the point that I wasn't a committed evolutionist. So my mind, let's say, was half open. And that allowed something to happen. It allowed me to change quite a bit of what I believed in 10th grade. And as what happens with most things, my life was changed because I met a girl.